Lucky centaur. He stopped and immediately turned off the engine. The road was deserted, and just to his left was the alley. He climbed off the motorcycle and cautiously walked to the bins, in case Cart was hiding behind them. As he walked, he could hear heavy breathing. Someone was panting, out of breath, and literally jumped up into the air when he heard a car stop behind his bike. He froze, in silence, but everything seemed calm. Perhaps it was the owner of a cafe, arrived early to open his shop. He glanced at the bins again. The breath got louder, and, as he moved closer, Chester saw a head on the ground. It was Cart, and, above him, with a hand covered in blood and a knife deep inside the boy's stomach, covered by a black coat, was his accursed father-in-law. As soon as he caught sight of Chester, he lifted Cart's sleeve to activate the cuff. He knew how to work it, of course, and wanted to carry him off to another place, another time. But Chester, faster than him, raised his arm and shot him with his ring, missing the target by inches and destroying the wall behind him. But the collapsing bricks hit the man on the head, and he collapsed, injured. But even with a deep wound bleeding across his head, the man tried to get his hand on the cuff. Behind him, Chester heard someone chamber around and envisaged his demise in that dark and dirty alley. A loud shot filled his ears, but it was not aimed at him. It hit his enemy in the shoulder, and the man dropped to the ground, lifeless, on his back. Chester could not believe he was still alive, and, turning around, he was surprised to see Rayon. His long gun still smoking in his hands, he said. "Help me. Let's get Cart into the car." They quickly got him into the back of the car, and Rayon told Chester to follow. He drove off at high speed, and Chester set off so fast that he suddenly realized that, in a panic, he had overtaken them, to the extent that all he could see of Rayon's car were two bright dots in the distance. He stopped abruptly with a gentle pressure on the powerful brakes. Once he caught up with him, Rayon led him out of the city, to the countryside. Dawn was breaking. The first sun rays warmed up the cold face of the centaur. In the distance, among trees, he saw a house. Once there, they turned off the engines, and the sudden and complete silence wrapped them within a surreal atmosphere. No birds sang, no frogs croaked in the nearby lake, absolutely nothing. They took Cart inside, easing him onto a long sofa. Chester was shocked to see that the wound was dry, unlike his clothes, which were soaked in blood. "I gave him the tablet, and it's working already. It's healing," said Rayon, pulling along a chair, to rest. "We need to wait for him to wake up. He's the only one who can take the codes back." Chester thought for a moment, then, "Hang on, wait? How long?" "Ariel could be in danger," he shouted, the adrenaline still rushing through him from what had happened and the fast ride. "Don't worry. Argo has arranged for everybody to be taken to his house. They'll be safe there," Rayon replied, closing his mobile, which had just provided him with instructions from Colonel Argo. "How did you know where I was?" Chester asked, and was disappointed in Rayon's laughter as a response. "I followed you. While you were busy having fun, I was keeping guard outside the house. The bounty killer who was after you both is still tied and locked up inside the baker's van, which I was lucky enough to find ready for use with its doors open, near your bike. He's probably doing his deliveries now, blissfully unaware that he has a murdered in the back." Still laughing, he asked Chester if he had the codes, and Chester nodded. Then he poured them both a strong drink and proceeded to tell him what had happened. His father-in-law had manipulated him since the beginning, staging the encounter between Chester and his daughter. She followed his orders, afraid of her father. The old man had traveled in time, in his youth, and, ambitious businessman, he had seen something that made it his priority to keep Ariel and Chester under his control, but at the same time, he could not kill them or the future would have changed, and he could not have changed the course of events. Besides, he was more used to him alive than dead. He had been financing a secret space project for years, a project led by an unscrupulous professor, with the specific intent to communicate with aliens who had visited our planet with interest thousands of years in the past, but who could not be contacted by our scientists, as their planet was protected by a shield that impeded visibility, even by X-ray. By offering the secrets of our race, methods of submission and details of all our mineral reserves, they would have asked in exchange to be granted the position of exclusive ambassadors on Earth, granting them absolute power. Angry at the terrifying plan, Chester beat his fists against his own head, saying, "That's why, when I met Ariel, I felt I was living someone else's life. I am grateful to Diana's friend for sticking her in and telling her all those lies." Rayon answered, with a smirk, "No, my friend, the only person you have to thank is Argo." And he explained that the gossip was Sarah, a daughter of his, a cunningly clever woman, with a degree in psychology and criminology, ex-army and her father's right hand. Argo was himself a psychiatrist and researcher for the armed forces, graded a colonel. Chester knew he was involved in a dark and dangerous circle, but he had not yet realized, at least not until then, how important his position was in all this. He had fathered a man who would go on to save the world. There was talk of the military, time machines, mad scientists, aliens, and merciless killers. He was frightened, but also eager to carry on and not give up. It was his chance to prove what he was made of and, best of all, to show Ariel that he had become a real man. He just wanted to get on and put an end to that ugly affair and return to his beloved and beautiful woman and make up for lost time. He glanced around. He had not realized what a nice house he had stepped into. Behind the sofa, where Cart slept deeply, was a beautiful window, about 20 meters wide and at least 10 meters high, with strange blue reflections. He looked closer and, from there, he could see his bike parked in the tall grass, and he realized that the glass he was looking through was thick, very thick, in fact. Disoriented, he could not make out exactly how thick the glass was and what, exactly, was its purpose. "It's 1/2 meter thick. It's not glass, but titanium glass with graphene. It's stronger than any building material and can even resist missiles without so much as a scratch," Rayon told him, with much satisfaction. He explained that they were inside a superbunker built with materials and techniques from the future. Chester realized that his friend was telling the truth. When they had arrived, he was still in shock from the gunfight, so he had not noticed that the outer walls of the building were at least 2 meters thick. He turned around and was shocked at the realization that the front door itself was not a commonly armored door, but a thick sliding panel, nearly as thick as the walls. Yet, Rayon could open it with ease, so it could not have been made of steel, but of a really light material. Rayon filled his glass to the brink and invited his friend to do the same, saying, "Try this. It's not from the future, but from my grandfather's cellar. It's a distilled mint liquor." Chester poured himself half a glass of the drink, then followed him, to see the rest of the bunker. They went up to the first floor, where the ceiling was lower, but Chester found himself inside a huge hall. Its decor was stylish and in good taste, with wooden furniture and a very large crystal table in the center, surrounded by no less than 30 chairs, made of the same material. Everything was spotlessly clean, right up to every hidden corner. Their footsteps echoed as they walked up to the floor above. To Chester's amazement, they did not enter another hall, but a dome and, at its center, an enormous cannon with a frighteningly large firing hole, which reached the edge of the room. The walls were clearly removable, in order to grant that lethal weapon a voice in the hour of need, at which point it would shoot cannonballs the size of cars, black, currently stocked in tall columns either side of the cannon. "But why? Who are you so afraid of that you need to defend yourself to these extents?" asked Chester, shocked by that level of weaponry. "Oh, this isn't my place. This superbunker belongs to Argo. This is where he gathers his people for meetings and such." Smiling at his guest's amazement, Rayon invited him to go downstairs with him, to the basement. "What is this stuff?" "It's like petrol." Rayon turned to look at Chester, who was coughing so hard that he was bent double and spitting the liquor made by his grandfather, which he had downed like a shot, in an attempt to free his hands of the glass. He was cleaning his dribble with his shirt sleeve. "It's good. Never mind any miracle tablets. This will bring you back to life." Rayon answered, laughing raucously, then downed his own drink, licked the glass and burped loudly, like a lunatic. As they walked downstairs, Chester tried to free its tongue of that hideous taste by licking his sleeve, hoping not to be seen, then put the glass down on the ground, still grimacing and wishing to throw up. He concluded that it would have made for great fuel to race his bike. The basement was not quite as described by his guide, a cellar, no less. It was an immense garage with a large sliding door about 100 meters along its depth, which probably lead to an exit ramp, because frankly, all those amazing vehicles had to get out of there somehow. There were sport cars in unusual colors, which he had only ever seen on paper, large 4x4s and lorries suitable for serious off-road travel, armed with cannons on their roof and rear, probably laser-powered, 3 tanks, one of which hovered above ground, with a strangely small gun, but no doubt about it, it was probably just as lethal as the others. There was a sort of large boat on wheels, with open boxes containing hundreds of grenades, but the thing which left Chester truly speechless was a sort of metal spider, with blades on its legs. It works on magnetic repulsion technology, nothing futuristic. Argo's team refined it over 20 years ago, Rayon said, referring to the floating tank, and then pointed to some vehicles hidden in the shadows, no bigger than a car, shaped like the point of an arrow, black with blue veins, so to speak. They appeared to have neither doors nor windows and no engine. Come to that. These vehicles also floated off the ground. Rayon looked at his pal and said, "Now, those are alien. They were found on the dark side of the moon, with lifeless armed bodies inside, preserved in perfect condition. They are over 3,000 years old, yet the weapons are deadly enough to annihilate anything they shoot at. It's powerful stuff. Almost as good as my granddad's brew." And with that, Rayon roared with laughter, obviously drunk, as Chester concluded whilst looking at the wall on his right, which he realized was an armory. Weapons of every sort and caliber were lodged inside spaces carved out of the wall itself. There was enough material to support an army. Scary, eh? You won't believe it, but one of the most spectacular and powerful weapons is the very thing you have on your wrist. Chester touched the cuff and thought that, if things really were as Rayon said, what he had achieved through that little thing so far was nothing compared to its true potentiality. They returned to the ground floor and sat on sofas opposite Cart, who was still in deep sleep. "Why?" Chester asked. Rayon answered, sipping on yet more of that vile nectar as if it was cool water, that many times rich and powerful people had got together with corrupt politicians in the intent to contact and reach other worlds, in order to govern and dominate an entire world and its inhabitants undisturbed. In this case, though, the cruel and merciless professor had made a mistake, because, out of the thousands of species across the universe, he encountered the most violent of all, an ancient race which for millions of years has based its existence on the colonization and destruction of other species. If the satellite sent with information about Earth and humanity got into their hands, each and every human being would either have been enslaved or killed within months, and, once all planet resources had run out, included our precious water, which would have been frozen and transported with them, they would have returned to their own planet. Terrified by what could have been, Chester gazed through the window into the woods, but something stirred him out of that apparent state of catalepsy. Someone had followed them there. Through the tall, thick trees and bushes, men dressed entirely in black appeared, their faces covered, and they were armed to the teeth. It was a small army, the same which had kidnapped him on the day of his wedding. The first line of them pointed their machine guns to the window, and in a panic Chester screamed, "Now what do we do? They are too many. What can we do?" as the shots came firing towards him. "Press the ring against the glass," shouted Rayon, but Chester was frozen with fear. He could not move a muscle. The young nurse jumped to his side, grabbed his arm and pressed the limp hand against the glass, banging the ring against it. "They want to kill us. They stopped you from being with Ariel. They want to kill her and your son," he shouted in his ear. As he heard the words kill, Ariel and son, Chester felt a powerful surge of anger, and it instantly powered the ring, which released a spark and turned the entire window blue, like a magnifying lens, which suddenly released a laser as tall and wide as itself and incinerated everything within 100 meters of its path. In utter disbelief, Chester removed his hand from the window, which instantly returned to its original transparency. Outside, it was as if a giant scraper had cleared the way for a wide road. There were neither trees nor rocks, and definitely no trace of the assassins. Rayon patted him on the shoulder and said, "Bravo! Well done, mate. Now you know what your weapon can do and how to use it." Chester raised his arm to look at that deadly ring, suddenly aware that it was directly powered by his emotions. The noise had woken Cart, who stood up slowly, perfectly recovered and with no sign of the wound received earlier. "At last. I'll get your clothes." Coughing and clearing his voice, the soldier addressed his companions seriously. "I have to find the professor and take his back with me." He explained that, at the hospital, his comrade had failed, and it was his responsibility to finish the job and take the professor to a place and time in which he could not have caused humanity any harm, where he could not affect the future of the planet by causing an apocalyptic war. Rayon put the clothes on the table, then opened a large wardrobe and took out a pair of large rifles and said, "Now we're ready to go." With a gulp, Chester nodded, aware that he would need to use that weapon, but he was a little afraid of the idea. Rayon was first to the door and declared, "Let's start the hunt from the president's office." But Chester was afraid to see that man again, especially after he had discovered exactly what a heartless man he really was, and that he would have stopped at nothing to kill his son-in-law. However, he plucked up his courage and faced his destiny, strong in the knowledge that his father-in-law had ordered Ariel's murder. He stood tall and left the superbunker with the heavy rifle tightly in his grasp. He mounted the motorbike and smiled at the realization that the large bag on its side was a gun holder, designed for a weapon of that size. He put the rifle inside it, and it fitted perfectly. He adjusted the bullet belt around his waist, so that the bullets were at his side, so he could lean his torso comfortably against the cold tank. He turned on the engine, which boomed a thundering sound which echoed through the forest. Rayon and Cart got into the car, after having loaded a missile launcher into its booth. Then they set off at the speed of sound. Along the journey, Chester reflected upon the strange shape of that building, which many people considered extraordinary in its singular architecture, especially the rich and powerful friends of the president. It was proof that he had seen the future and had tried to replicate it. It was in the shape of a gigantic missile, a cylinder which narrowed to a round point at the top. Instead of walls, the outside was entirely covered by windows. Chester had never liked it. It looked much more like a gigantic glass suppository to him. As they arrived and stopped outside the entrance gate, the fearsome guard had heard their arrival by the roars of the engines and paced quickly towards them, gun in hand. He looked ready to fire, but he stopped suddenly and answered his phone, which had been ringing persistently. He nodded, as if approving orders. He replaced the gun in the holster inside his jacket and briskly walked to the small side gate, whilst phoning somebody else. Chester did not understand the man's odd behavior. One minute he seemed ready to shoot them down, the next he hurried away and left the main entrance unattended, but even more disorienting was the sight of the reception staff retracing the guard's steps in the distance. The ground floor of the building was left completely empty, or at least that was how it looked. A bunch of armed, hooded men ran outside and spread out into a semicircle, but before they had time to shoot, Rayon launched a rocket in their direction. The rocket's trail of white smoke concluded with a devastating deflagration. The glass doors shuttered into 1,000 pieces, same as all the windows of that floor and many of the luxurious items of furniture. They walked into the building through the crowd of employees who ran outside screaming. Some screamed, "It's an earthquake." Others, "It's the end of the world." And if Cart did not immediately get back to his own time with the codes, it would have been the end of the world. Chester led the way, as the office they were heading for was right next to where his own office had been. Dodging the maddening flow of people in fear, they arrived to find not the old wooden door to the office, but one of armored steel. Chester did not lose hope, as his anger was sufficient to charge his weapon. He pointed his fist against the thick hinges and fired. The ring followed its orders to perfection and destroyed both hinges, allowing the door to fall to the ground with a simple push. In the wall, the safe was open and empty, so was the room, but for one thing, 2 legs appeared behind the desk. Chester recognized the expensive loafers at their feet. He stepped towards the desk slowly, and behind it he found Mario, unconscious. He had a bandage on one arm, soaked in the blood of what were evidently gunshot wounds. Chester had heard the shots when he left his house. He had then seen the assassin drag him outside, but he had not killed him. He had just wounded him, probably having a better use for him alive than dead. Rayon stood with his rifle pointed at the doorway, to cover his friends' backs. Cart checked whether the man on the floor was still alive, by placing an ear on his chest, and yes, he was still breathing.